Welcome to Unfinished Lives, a podcast where we delve into the stories of people whose lives were tragically cut short, yet whose impact and voice resonate through history. Today we explore the life and legacy of Jane Mixer, a bright, ambitious young woman who had everything ahead of her. But her journey was brutally ended on March 21st of that year when she was found murdered in a cemetery near Ann Arbor, Michigan. She was just 23. Jane Mixer's body was discovered on March 21st, 1969, in a cemetery just west of Ann Arbor, Michigan. She lay on a stranger's grave, shot twice in the head, with a garrote still looped around her neck, a tragic end to her promising life at 23. The 1960s in America were a time of transformation and upheaval. The civil rights movement, protests against the Vietnam War, and a generational shift in values all created a climate of change. A new wave of feminism was rising, with women challenging the traditional housewife of roles of the 1950s and stepping boldly into the workforce, universities, and public life. In 1969, Jane Louise Mixer was in the midst of this cultural shift. She was a first-year law student at the University of Michigan, a political activist, and engaged to Phil Weitzman, who described her as possessing an intellect, intense curiosity, a budding sensitivity, social issues, ambition, and later on physical beauty. But on that March day, his life too would fracture. A few years before, Jane had traveled through France, hitchhiking across Europe. She wrote to her sister Barbara about the thrill of independence. There's some kind of indescribable joy about climbing on a second-class car in the railway station in Marseille and taking off for God knows where. I almost have a mystique about it. Jane's journals, later compiled by her niece Maggie Nelson, reveal a young woman searching for meaning. She wrote about conflicts with her parents over politics, her insecurities, her desires, and her evolving sense of self. In 1960, she wrote, "There's so much now that yesterday doesn't matter. I have so much and I'm so lucky. Who could ask for more? I am happy. Tomorrow I may not be. Yesterday I wasn't, but I am now Elle, and that's all that matters. Now, I must remember that and never forget it." Jane was serious, introspective, outspoken, intelligent, and fiercely independent. Her bright spirit, at just 23 years old, would tragically be extinguished on March 21st, 1969. Yet another injustice awaited her, as her murder became simply one more in a series of killings that haunted the errant Bay Area in the late 1960s. This wasn't a deliberate injustice, but rather a series of tragic coincidences. Jane matched the other victims' profile and died during the same terrifying period. Perhaps investigators and the public clung to the notion of one killer because the idea of more than one violent predator in such a small area was too horrific to consider. Jane Mixer's story is entwined with the Michigan murders, also known as the co-ed murders. However, her story has long been buried beneath this broader tragedy. For now, let's only introduce that dark chapter, as we'll take a deeper look into the Michigan murders in the next podcast. In March 1969, Jane's life was filled with promise. She was in her first year of law school, one of only 37 women in a class of 420, with a focus on politics and civil rights litigation. She was newly engaged to Phil Weitzman, an economics professor and fellow political advocate. Phil's liberal views and Jewish background had strained his relationship with Jane's parents, who felt he had swayed her toward campus activism. Nonetheless, they were preparing for a move to New York, where Phil had accepted a position at NU. Jane planned to break the news gently to her parents before Phil joined her for spring break in her hometown of Muskegon, Michigan. For those unfamiliar, Ann Arbor is located on the Lower East Side of Michigan, about 40 miles west of Detroit, while Muskegon lies on the opposite side of the state, north along Lake Michigan. In those days, hitchhiking and sharing rides were common and seen as safe. Jane, cautious but independent, didn't just hitchhike. She used a ride board in the student union's basement at the University of Michigan. After leaving her name and number in the Muskegon cubby, another student called and offered her a ride. He introduced himself as David Johnson. So let's step back to that chilly Thursday evening, March 20th, 1969. Jane and Phil were together in her dorm room at the Law Quadrangle on the University of Michigan campus. Though it was the first day of spring, Michigan still clung to the lingering browns and grays of winter. After saying goodbye, Phil left for a tutoring session, and at 6:30, Jane picked up the phone to confirm her ride with David Johnson. But the man on the other end insisted she was mistaken. David was in a play that night. Did Jane sense something was off after that call? If she did, it didn't stop her from leaving for the arranged ride. With her suitcase and a gift for her mother, Jane stepped out the door, disappearing into the Michigan night, never to be seen alive again. The first flickers of worry struck Jane's father around 10 p.m. Jane had called earlier, saying she'd found a ride to Muskegon and would arrive by 9:30. By 11 p.m., the worry deepened, and unable to wait any longer, Dan Mixer got in his car and drove the highway towards Ann Arbor, hoping to find his daughter. He searched for hours to no avail. At midnight, he called Jane's boyfriend, Phil, who hadn't seen who picked up it, but assumed she had left when he called her dorm at 7 p.m., and got no answer. As dawn approached with still no sign of Jane, Phil checked her dorm room at 4 a.m. and found her lights off. By 8 a.m., Dan filed a missing persons report for Jane. Phil returned to her room at the quad with a key, but nothing was amiss inside. Jane had only made it 14 miles into her planned 172-mile journey to Muskegon. Strangely, she hadn't traveled west toward Muskegon, but east in the opposite direction. The next morning, on March 21st, a chill lingered in the Michigan air as spring's thaw slowly set in. Nancy Groh, a housewife living near Denton Cemetery in Van Buren Township, awoke when her 13-year-old son hurried to catch the school bus. As she helped him prepare, he showed her a department store bag he'd found. Inside, Nancy discovered a gift-wrapped box with a card and some law school papers. The card read, "Dearest Mom, sorry I'm late for your birthday. But in 100 years you'll never know the difference. I love you, Janie." The gift inside was a pair of fuzzy purple slippers. After her son left, Nancy lifted the bag, her hand coming away sticky with blood. Alarmed, she got into her car, anxiously watching her son walk to the bus stop. As she passed Denton Cemetery, she noticed something yellow near the entrance, a raincoat, partially covering a body. Nearly hysterical, Nancy drove to her sister's house and called the police. By 10:30 a.m., Detective Donald Bennett and other officers arrived at the cemetery. There, just inside the fence, lay Jane Mixer's body. She'd been arranged with personal belongings, including a copy of Catcher in the Rye, clothing on hangers, and her suitcase around her. One arm was draped above her head, the other covering her eyes. The absence of blood at the scene indicated she hadn't been killed there, though she had been shot in the head and strangled with a stocking afterward. She wore a blue-gray jumper, her nylons and underwear partially pulled down. Fresh tire tracks and the single heel print were the only clues left by the killer. Dr. Robert Hendricks, the Washtenaw County medical examiner, determined Jane had been shot twice in the head. The bullets entered her left temple and lower skull. Soap granules on her coat led investigators to wonder if she'd been held in a laundry area. Jane's parents, despite their estranged relationship over political differences, identified her at the morgue. Her mother insisted on an open casket at the funeral, where a friend read Dylan Thomas's words, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage, against the dying of the light." Yet even this final goodbye was marred board, as police warned the Mixer family to watch for anyone suspicious at the service, suspecting the killer might attend. police delved into Jane's last known plans, starting with her ride-share arrangement. Jane had scheduled a ride with a man named David Johnson. A phone book in her dorm had a check mark beside his name, and Mixer and Muskegon were scribbled in the law school library's margins. But after questioning Johnson, a fraternity member and theater enthusiast performing in a play that night was cleared. Suspicion briefly turned to Phil Weitzman due to Dan Mixer's disapproval of their relationship. However, Phil's story held up and he had a solid alibi. The media soon merged Jane's case with other local murders, branding her another victim of the co-ed killer. But investigators noted the differences. Unlike the other cases marked by stabbings, beatings, and sexual assault, Jane's case involved a gun and no sexual assault. This cast doubt on her death being linked to John Norman Collins, who was later apprehended in July 1969, though suspicions of a separate killer remained. Decades passed. Then, in 2001, cold case detective Eric Schroeder reopened Jane's case. DNA testing, unavailable in 1969, had since become a forensic standard. At the State Crime Lab, analyst Steve Milligan examined Jane's pantyhose and isolated DNA from the killer, identifying 2 male profiles. Neither matched Collins, the convicted co-ed killer. One profile was linked to John Rulas, the convicted murderer. Yet in a stunning twist, Rulas was only 4 years old at the time of Jane's murder, casting his involvement into doubt and stalling progress. Meanwhile, Jane's niece, Maggie Nelson, had been working on a book about the aunt she'd never met, hoping to share her life and the haunting impact of her murder on the family. Maggie's memoir would eventually weave personal reflections in Jane's story, helping reveal another side to her aunt, a sharp, reflective young woman with profound thoughts on life. In 2004, as Maggie's book neared release, Detective Schroeder called with news that the case might finally be moving forward, providing a glimmer of closure for a family long haunted by a murder initially lost in the shadows of a larger, terrifying series. A year after Detective Schroeder's initial interview with John Rulas, he received another call from the State Crime Lab. DNA found on Jane's pantyhose had matched a 62-year-old Michigan man named Gary Leiterman, a retired nurse from Goebbels. Leiterman was married with 2 grown children. For over 2 months, Schroeder investigated Leiterman. In 1969, around the time of Jane's death, Leiterman had been a 26-year-old Navy veteran living just 20 miles from Ann Arbor. Though he had no criminal record, in 2001 he was arrested for forging prescriptions to feed an addiction to painkillers after suffering from kidney stones. After his conviction, his DNA was added to CODIS. In 2004, Schroeder brought Leiterman in for questioning. 3 hours into the interview, Schroeder revealed his evidence. Leiterman's DNA had been found on Jane's body. Leiterman, in an interview with CBS News, recounted his disbelief. I was incredulous. I said, "What do you mean my DNA?" Leiterman insisted on his innocence, stating he'd never met Jane Mixer. However, Schroeder viewed the DNA evidence on Jane's pantyhose as definitive proof of Leiterman's guilt. Leiterman was arrested just before Thanksgiving in 2004 and held without bail. During a search of his home, detectives found a Polaroid of a teenage girl, unconscious and partially undressed, in Leiterman's bedroom. The girl, a 16-year-old exchange student living with the Leitermans, later testified tearfully that she had no memory of the photo being taken. Leiterman claimed he had simply found the photo and kept it to show his wife upon her return from a trip. Detectives also discovered an unmarked vial in Leiterman's shaving kit containing a mixture of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, and diazepam found in Valium, which a toxicologist referred to as a knockout potion. In January, a hearing outlined the state's case. Maggie Nelson, Jane's niece, attended with her mother and grandfather. Nelson described her grandfather on the stand in her memoir Red Parts, recalling his aged appearance and how the possibility of exhuming Jane's body had troubled him. Additional evidence included testimony from a former co-worker who had once accused Leiterman of molesting her on a bus, and from a former roommate who claimed Leiterman had shown him a vial, boasting it could render a woman unconscious. A woman Leiterman had dated in the past also mentioned his struggles with sexual dysfunction. Much of this testimony, however, was ruled inadmissible. In 2005, Leiterman went on trial for Jane Mixer's 1969 murder. The prosecutor's theory was that Leiterman contacted Jane through her ride request at the University of Michigan using the alias David Johnson. He then picked her up around 6:30 p.m. on March 20th, took her to an undisclosed location, and, possibly after a failed sexual advance, shot her twice and strangled before disposing of her body in Denton Cemetery. The DNA evidence on Jane's pantyhose was the primary link to Leiterman. Additional evidence included a phone book from the university with the names Mixer and Muskegon scrawled inside. Handwriting expert Thomas Riley found it highly probable that Leiterman wrote the words. A former roommate also testified that Leiterman had a .22 revolver and once constructed a firing range in his basement. Records confirmed Leiterman had purchased a .22 caliber Ruger revolver in 1967, which he later reported stolen in 1987. During the trial, a ballistics expert testified that bullet fragments found during Jane's autopsy were comparable to those found in Leiterman's home in 2004, although he noted that over 36 models could fire similar bullets. Nelson's memoir details the unsettling display of evidence in the courtroom, including Jane's blood-streaked clothing and a jar containing a blood-stained tampon, preserved for decades. A DNA expert testified that the odds of Jane's pantyhose DNA matching someone other than Leiterman were 171.7 trillion to 1. Leiterman's defense argued that lab contamination might explain the presence of his DNA, given that a 4-year-old's DNA had also been found on Jane's hand, a finding highly suggestive of contamination, as the child had no connection to the crime scene. Leiterman's lawyer argued that this error could have extended to the pantyhose DNA sample. Prosecutors countered with testimony on the rigorous precautions taken at the lab to prevent contamination. Leiterman did not testify in his defense. After a 2-week trial, the jury returned a guilty verdict for first-degree murder after just a few hours of deliberation. Jane's father wept, while her sister described feeling numb. Nelson expressed mixed emotions in her memoir, reflecting a lingering uncertainty about whether conviction brought true closure. Following the verdict, Leiterman maintained his innocence, saying, "She appeared to be a lovely young lady. But I also want to say that I'm innocent of this crime. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole." Leiterman appealed his conviction, but no new trial was granted. In July 2019, he died in prison at age 74. Today, Jane Mixer's murder is officially considered solved.